to kind of unpack. Oh, thank you, Rose. One of the things that I think is really important to unpack is that when we are taking the time to think about our day and our schedule and the activities and experiences our students are and our children are going to have, we are going to optimize their learning and their development. So if we know we are using a play-based approach that's joyful and engaging, but also meets the domains that we're working on, those domains to develop a child appropriately, we're hitting both things. We're hitting the engagement piece for students, but we're hitting what they need in order to continue to make strong progress in those domains. So, developmentally appropriate practice happens in four domains. It happens in physical development, cognitive development, social emotional development, and that well-being piece. So when we hit all four of those, the physical, the cognitive, the social, and the emotional, we are working on a developmentally appropriate framework. So if you can think even just about those items that you put into the chat, chances are those opportunities that you came to the table with to say, this is my number one thing I love doing, or this is what I'm really good at, it probably fits into maybe one of those or is a combination of those all together, which is kind of cool to think one of the things that we love doing or that I'm so proud of hits maybe more than one domain. Another thing to consider is that when we're doing developmentally appropriate practice, we're recognizing that we are going to fine tune the work we do to allow our children to kind of show us what they're ready for. We are going to use their interests. We're going to use what we know about learning progression and frameworks to help us say, here's what we know is really where they're at in our 3 and 4 year old room. Here's what we know we can get them ready for when they hit this stage of learning or when they're getting closer to having that frontal lobe and those brain connections and some of those, the capacity, right, to think about somebody else, which doesn't happen until, say, they're after the age of 7, because they're still kind of maybe an egocentric child. So helping them work through some of those things, we can kind of tell this is more developmentally appropriate based on their readiness or their interests. Another key kind of foundational pillar of developmentally appropriate practice is that it's flexible. There's not a one size, there's not a one program. We know that what one person is doing and what one caregiver is going to see in their child has to stay flexible, and what's going to work in one environment might look and sound different in another. But if we can align it back to, is it child ready? Is it child interest focused? And is it developmentally appropriate in our 4 domains? We know we are meeting that success criteria we're wanting to see. Another key piece of developmentally appropriate practice is that it puts the student at the center. It values them as a key contributor to the community, which I think is so helpful to think about when we're knowing that relationships are at the core of what we do in teaching, and knowing that if I'm continuing to center my plans, what I want to have as an experience or a thematic study around the student interests, we know that engagement and that joyful learning is going to be there as well. And last but not least, one of the big things related to developmentally appropriate practice is around this idea of literacy and literacy development. So I'm just going to pull out that cognitive domain for a second, because literacy is one of the key components of students being ready to communicate with one another, to use language to communicate and convey ideas and meaning and understanding. And then that language is then going to lead into that important work of literacy development for reading and writing. And so we can see developmentally appropriate practice has a language component threaded through all 4. Language is used for physical development, it's used for cognitive development, it's used for social development, and it's used for emotional development. We know we can support our students when they can tell us how they're feeling, they can show us how they're feeling through drawings, through verbiage. So language really threads all 4 of those domains together to support developmentally appropriate practice. And then I always love to pull something from NACE because I think it really anchors a lot of the work we do in early childhood, but it shares here educators who engage in a DAP or developmentally appropriate practice framework foster young children's joyful learning and maximize the opportunities for each and every child to achieve their full potential. So of course that's what we all want. So we can make that happen. Wonderful. Okay, Rose, if you don't mind going to the next. Okay, perfect. So this may look a little small on your screen, but we're going to unpack each of these in a little bit more detail. But I thought it'd be helpful just to kind of see the 8 principles pulled out in an infographic. So you could maybe use them, come back to it, clip this if you wanted to. I know you have the PDF, so you could use it down the road, but having these 8 principles in mind, we're going to start with the first one, which is knowing child development and learning age-related norms. And then we'll roll into understanding individual variability. We'll lead into cultural and social context, play-based learning, integrate curriculum and active learning, positive relationships, intentional teaching, and ongoing assessment to inform our practice. So I'll touch on a little bit, but not get too geeky because I can geek out for a long time, and share a little bit, and then have Rose come in with some pictures that illustrate what we're thinking and talking about here. So let's start with the first one. So knowing child development and learning age-related norms. This is important because it allows us to flex our planning and our work. We can use age-related norms and knowing our child development progressions to allow us to scaffold and to level up when we need to and keep the pace, maybe in a little bit of a different phase or of a different moment for certain children. It allows us to differentiate and meet their capacity. So if they're ready for more, if they're showing us their interest for more, we can see where are we headed on the continuum, where can we go next, which I think again kind of goes back to optimizing the learning process for our students, which we want. So one of the big gurus in this, of course, is Piaget's learning, and he highlights some work around cognitive development and helping us understand, say, when students start to understand an object that's hidden is still going to be there, even if someone hides or not. So this idea of like peekaboo, right? Once a child moves out of that 0 to 2 age, they start to kind of understand that symbiotic or symbolic thought, I should say, symbolic thought and representation of ideas. They can know that an image is going or a person is going to stay there, and they don't have to have that emotional fear or worry. We can see that when we are working with our students on, say, social conversations. As I mentioned earlier, we can see in that pre-operational stage, egocentrism, not being able to see someone else's point of view is normal. Those things are developmentally appropriate. So we don't want to move someone too fast based on kind of their brain development, where they're able to handle things. So having this allows us to kind of flex up or stay in an appropriate range. Of course, there's not those concrete, as soon as you're 7, we're going to be ready to think about others. That's just not always the case. I have a 7-year-old right now, and that's not the case in several instances, but I have seen so much growth and progression, and it allows a family member too to be able to kind of empathize, or for you to be able to kind of convey an idea that, okay, that's okay. These things happen. We'll get there. It can kind of give you that relational connection to families if they're looking like, man, I'm at my wit's end, I'm not sure. And for you as an educator to kind of have that knowledge too. So the next developmentally appropriate practice I'll get into in a second. Rose, do you want to share a little bit more about what that looks like too?
Absolutely. Okay, so how you can take that, understanding the developmental domains, right? You guys probably have all access to the South Dakota Early Learning Guidelines. If you don't, please let us know because you can get them for free as a licensed provider. The online copy is also free as well, which we're going to go over at the end of the training, but the PDF is there as well. And what I love about the way that that is framed is the word that Sydney used earlier is the continuum. It allows for some crossover, right? So it's not just by 18 months they have to be here. No, it's 18 months through the stage of, 24 months. That gives a little bit of window, and I think it allows you then to meet those children where they're at. Just because they're not where their peers are right now doesn't mean that you can't scaffold activities to get them there, right? So that's what that ELGs, they're just so beautifully well done, and we're going to go over that at the end. Some other things then is just understanding where they are at physically too. So one of my soapboxes, if you've ever taken a training from me before, is when we force things before a child is ready, sometimes their brain's not going to be able to understand it, right? We're forcing them out of the next step that is within their capability. And sometimes it's physically, they're not ready for it. And my example here is when we force handwriting or the pencil grip in the correct way before they're ready for it, we can actually be causing more harm than we are doing good for the child. They're going to form their hand in a way that is going to cause bad habits. And when they get into public school and move through their educational career, now they have to correct some of that. So I always like to throw up this X-ray when I'm talking about this, just so that you can see that visual representation of how the skeleton forms and how much growth and changes from that 4 years to 7 years. So think of those 4-year-olds that were saying kindergarten readiness, they have to write their name. Maybe not. Maybe they can if it comes naturally and their hand is okay with grabbing it. But just because a child can't, it doesn't mean that they're not ready for kindergarten, and it doesn't mean that they won't by the age of 7, because look at the change in that skeleton by then. And so then if you're not going to force them, how can you move them through that continuum, right? What is their next step? And so I have a picture here, and you're going to see a lot of little Miss Isla, and this is Sydney's daughter when I taught her. How can you strengthen and move them through? One of the things, right, of pre-writing skills are those fine motor skills, right? So how are you using that? And one of the, go-tos is like Play-Doh, right? But there's so many other ways that we can improve their dexterity and improve their strength. And this one is they were just stabbing toothpicks to create the first letter in their name in pumpkins because it was fall time. So this is just something that you can do to find where they're at and move them towards the next step. Those pre-writing skills, though, they might not even be here. And pre-writing skills also are gross motor too. So if you look at a toddler and they don't have the core strength to sit up and hold their pencil, they're not ready, right? If they're, leaning over. So really you think we start here and we grow out, right? In the development of our skills. So even having core strength is a pre-writing skill. They have to be able to maintain here before it moves to their shoulder strength, before elbow, and on and on. So if you're forcing it before they're ready, you're going to force bad habits. Okay. We will move on to principle number 2, and I'll turn it back over to Sydney.
Okay, awesome. So the next one is understanding individual variability. And this is the idea that each child is unique. And so we want to be considering our individuals. As we talked in the previous one, we want to be using the developmentally appropriate practices to understand their readiness, but also understand their learning interests as well as their abilities and their profile as a learner. So what that means is we're using kind of 3 things Carol Ann Tomlinson, who's kind of the guru for differentiation, wants us to think about first. So when we have our individual, we think about their interests, their readiness, but their profile. And that profile might mean their cultural background, their home life. That might mean what they need in terms of interventions if they have been diagnosed early with a speech development delay or with something that has already shown some cognitive dissonance. We might notice that we have a family who's an English language learner. So we want to take that profile, their readiness in terms of getting started with tasks and their readiness to handle certain things that we've got going on in our classroom and their interest to kind of package what's called kind of differentiation or scaffold in their zone of proximal development. If you've ever heard the kind of leading expert in this area as well, named Vygotsky. He's kind of known for the ZPD, or zone of proximal development. So when we're working with our students, we're obviously going to know that a one size fits all approach isn't going to work. So we can take a look at how can we vary what we're going to do in our classroom so that we meet everybody's needs. If you want to go to the next slide, Rose, he's got kind of some key cornerstones here that's helpful. He really believes that the learner develops in social context. So we want our children to be interacting with others because we not only learn from adults who might have a new level of understanding, but peers also have a new level of understanding. So a child can learn maybe how blocks are built, how they can stack, how they can balance versus an unbalanced stack from a peer. And when we think about leveling or scaffolding or helping learn and work with individual variability, which is that second principle, we can not only utilize us as a scaffold for students, but we can utilize students as scaffolds. We can be thoughtful about how we form small groups, how we create centers, how we utilize those in our classrooms to support collaboration, partnerships, developmental language opportunities. One of the biggest things I've learned about teaching reading is that they need to hear the language first. They need to use the language first before they're able to start really reading and writing it. So if we can have our children modeling with each other, maybe even hear a higher level sentence or a new vocabulary word that a child hasn't heard before from their peer, from ourselves, we know that they're ready for that next step. It's pretty cool to see how that social learning theory really does support developmentally appropriate practice and individualized variability. So, Rose, if you want to take it to an example next.
Absolutely. So, I'll get to these pictures in a second, but I want to make sure I'm meeting some of you infant toddler teachers where you're at. So for an example, even in the infant classroom, you're probably wondering, well, they can't be social, right? They're not speaking to one another, but so much of our communication is done non-verbally, right? So when they start to have those interactions with their peers and like taking a toy from one another and seeing a child's face and they don't like that, starting to recognize those emotions, watching a peer maybe pull themselves up on a bookshelf, they're going to learn through all of those social interactions. Another really great example is when you hear of parents who, maybe have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who's never been in care, never been around children, and they're speech delayed, they get into a center or a daycare and it just explodes, right? Where did that come from? Well, it can't all be us teachers, right? We would love to say that it is, but it's not. It's that immersion into that social environment where they were able to, like Sydney just said, they hear it, they're exposed to it. And it's so beautiful to see that. So even though sometimes infant toddler teachers, I know you guys probably are like, well, this doesn't apply to me. It does. It absolutely does. You just have to break it down in a way that you can see it and practice in your classroom. These two pictures again of Isla, what I wanted to talk about here for the individual variability are, so this is a Montessori 3-part lesson over here with the study of trees. Now, we had multiple ways that they could learn about this, but not all the children were ready to engage in identifying letter matching and word matching, as you can see here. So how are we going to meet those children where they're at? And how are we going to then move them to the next step? And so there are different ways that you can approach the learning objective that you're teaching them. So to start off with, if I had a child who was still struggling with even letter identification, maybe we're just going to start off with the puzzle and we're going to get exposure to those pieces before we move up. So really it comes back to you understanding where the individual child is at, and that each child in your classroom is going to have a varied educational experience, and even, like Sydney said, cultural experience that they bring to the table. And what does that look like? So you have to be able to change your approach for each one, then allowing them to have different ways to learn about it. So here is a dramatic play that is set up. And just because a child can do something doesn't mean that you should force them to do it, right? They need to be interested in what you're teaching for it to feel authentic and relevant to them. So how do we as the teacher design different ways for them to learn about all of the concept and learning objectives that you have? Well, if they love to go to dramatic play and dress up, how can you do some math concepts there? Come up with some sort of monetary system, right? Some way where they're exchanging a dollar, where they have to make change. Okay, I gave you $3. What am I going to get back? So just find ways to meet your teaching objectives, whatever your lesson plans are, through different varied avenues. Find ways that each child feels seen in your classroom. So have a wealth of options in there. And just because a child can do it, again, don't force them to do it. Find a way to meet them where they're at. All right.
Okay, so the next developmentally appropriate practice we have is cultural and social context. This is an important part of developmentally appropriate practice as it helps us understand that our children are going to be a really important part of your community, and what they bring to the table can be very much influenced from their cultural and family background. We want to engage in honoring and valuing their perspectives. We want to value and honor the way that they are creating a family at their home and how we're creating a family in our community, in our classroom. And we can do that by being culturally responsive. We can take the opportunity to get to know our students' backgrounds, take time to get to know our families. Some of this seems pretty straightforward, but research shows that when we have a deeper connection to where our children are coming from, and we've taken the time to kind of better understand what that means, holidays and traditions that are important and valuable in their home life, we see that the bridge is built in a more strategic way, but intentional and caring way. So there's different ways that we can be culturally responsive, and some of them are more maybe understanding kind of a multicultural educational approach. We want to honor what that might mean. But culturally responsive also means that we're setting high expectations for every single child, no matter their background, and we're making it relevant and responsive to them. So we think back to kind of connecting the first two developmentally appropriate practices into now what this practice means. So we can be thinking about different ways students can process information because that's going to be responsive to them. We can think about how many of our children are going to be better oral communicators, maybe versus what they can show us physically or model physically, and then vice versa. Some students are going to be able to model and show us more physically versus being able to orally communicate. So it kind of depends on, of course, the traditions, the values, and the way your children are communicating in their home lives that kind of impacts the way they're showing up for us in our schools and in our community in the classroom. So it's helpful to understand how the brain learns to read, to understand where our children are coming from, and then kind of marry the two. So this is something that I found. We shared it as a resource for you guys before you joined today, but I just snipped a small section of it just for time purposes. But there are some questions that are in different arenas for thinking about being culturally responsive and relevant. And to me, this goes back to kind of our theme for the night, making sure that we think about our learners as individuals. So, how we're helping them show what they know and meeting their learning needs. Thinking about, okay, how do I take the time to really get to know my families? Is there an area that I could get better at, or I could do that a little bit? Better, or maybe what I'm doing is working really well because I know every single one of my families. I know what they like, I know what they value, and you can probably tell that because you've taken that time to develop those systems, the time that you've poured in has now transferred to really being able to meet that student and kind of use that to your advantage when you're working with them. Allows you to do what's called kind of an asset-based approach for your students, taking what they know and what they value from their home life and using that as a strength.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Sydney. So, some of the ways that you guys are probably already doing it, you're incorporating books, right? You're finding books that speak to different cultures, different races, different ages, professions. You're probably using music. So, and then also materials within your classroom. Like those are all pretty common and easy ways to make sure that you are providing a culturally rich environment. Make sure you're inviting the families to be a part of that. So Sydney touched on that, is having that conversation with them about what do they put value on, what is important to them, what does their home life look like. So the underlying thing here is those relationships, right? They're going to be able to have those conversations with you once you've established a strong relationship with them. They're going to feel open and know that you are trying to meet them on where their child is at and hear their hopes and dreams for their child. Sometimes it varies, you know. When I was a director recently, we had a child who came in who English was his third language. He had two languages above that. And normally, my approach here would be, yep, we're going to get home language everywhere. We're going to have, everything is going to be labeled in home language so that he feels right at home. Actually, these parents did not want that. They wanted full immersion into English. They wanted that to be the form of communication. They wanted this child to have that opportunity. So it's really important that even though my mindset was I've got to provide, this child needs to feel welcome, make sure you're listening to the parents and meeting them where they're at.
May I add to that just because he is my child now? This little boy pretends he doesn't even know the other languages. He only speaks to me in Spanish or in English. When I ask him what's the Spanish word to this, what's the Russian word to this, he says he doesn't know. He only speaks English now, Rose. Only English. I don't know what happened. Mom's not happy.
That's hilarious. It'll come back. It's like riding a bike. Those things don't go away.
He,
So,
he knows them.
yeah.
That's the worst part. I will say, "What's this?" in Spanish and be like, "I don't know." But then you'll hear him talk to mom and he'll say the exact same thing. I'm like, "Yeah, you do too, know."
So,
He
yeah,
has changed 100% in the last year we've had him.
right.
Like full
It's
force.
it's so beautiful to see those because he was able to do that because we were able to meet where the parents were at, right? We had
Exactly. Yep. We were able to make what they needed him to do. We did that for him. And he only speaks English now.
So it's beautiful. So I also taught ESL courses for almost 5 years. I taught to students in Japan, China, and South Korea. And so I got to have a really rich cultural learning experience as the teacher coming into a classroom. So I got to learn a lot. I got exposure to different holidays, like Spring Festival is such a beautiful thing. So just understanding that your students and your families in your care are going to have different holidays. Sydney touched on that, and different things that they're going to celebrate. When I was a teacher, also another one that isn't as common is we had a family who didn't believe in Christmas, but they practiced celebrating winter solstice. So how do you make sure that that family feels that they have an opportunity in December, which is all about Christmas, to have their voice heard and their celebrations honored? And so what we did then is we changed how we approached when he got to speak about it. And we allowed him to have a day where he came in and showed everything they did. And it was so beautiful. And these children had asked great questions. And plus, now we have a science term. What is winter solstice, right? Here's a whole learning topic off of that. So think of all the beautiful things that happen when you celebrate each family and meet them where they're at. Again, here in the pictures, you can see some writing or some painting. At the time, we had a student in this facility who was adopted, who was from China, and the mom was really huge on having this child understand their heritage and where they came from. So we got fully immersed in a lot of activities, and I loved it because I had been a teacher in that type of capacity. So took it and ran with it, and the children loved it. And then even over here in a different way, meeting a child in a different way that they want to learn about something. Looks like just a tray of sand. However, he here is telling a story in Aboriginal from Australia. And these were just some different ways that they would be able to visually story tell. And it was so cute to hear them then talk stories about what they drew and come up with that. So there's different ways that you can expose them. And then just also make sure though that you are being culturally sensitive, that you are not appropriating anything when you are teaching it. And one example that I've learned since then, one of my first years teaching, is we built a totem pole in the month of October to celebrate Native American Day. And I thought I was doing a beautiful thing. I thought we were talking about it. However, having these children who were not Native American create totem pieces actually was insulting to anybody that was of that culture. And so that was something I didn't know. And it was something I didn't learn until many years after the fact. So just being able to engage in that self-reflection, and if you're ever worried about what you're planning or how to make sure that it isn't appropriating their culture, I would say reach out to a local educational agency. In our case, I loved using Black Hills State because they have an amazing Native American department, and just saying, hey, help me, is this okay? And I guarantee that any educator, any professor is going to love to offer you advice and tidbits. So, all right, moving on to principle 4.
Okay, wonderful. So the next one is play-based learning. And this one, of course, is to hone in the fact that play is the epicenter for kids. It is their number one. It allows them to explore, to experiment, to have social interaction, and it supports those 4 domains that we talked about earlier. So it's going to hit the cognitive, the physical development, the social, and the emotional. So it's one of those opportunities to link all 4 domains together in one learning opportunity, or in the day, as we kind of foster play-based approach or frameworks, play-based learning opportunities. Some of us, this is like no problem. Like we do this all the time. And you might find, especially if you're more of a public educator at this point, or if you are in a center that has stakeholders that are looking for things that are standards based or curriculum aligned, that you might find that your knowledge of play based, or your desire to have play based, is at war with the knowledge and the need for other things to be happening based on where you're at. I would argue though that if we can understand how we can use it to the best of our ability, then we can kind of advocate for what we know is developmentally appropriate, and that is play. So, for example, having something as simple as readers' theater, having the opportunity for your students to play and sort and show what they understand and what they're finding and discovering related to say shapes or textures or color. You're going to be able to teach those things or get to those levels of kind of the continuum as we talked about through those explorations, through their opportunity to experiment. We don't have to say, this is the color blue, and just teach it in a physical way, kind of like that with a lecture type work, which we know is not developmentally appropriate for kids. So one of the best things to think about here is that language, again, is kind of at the bedrock of all of these experiences. So even if we're in an infant toddler space, we're still framing and modeling the language. If we're playing a game, we're still using the appropriate language we want our students to do for social development, for say a cognitive skill we're hoping that they will begin to start to be introduced to, then develop, then have mastery around. So, Rose, if you want to lead into some examples next.
Absolutely. Okay, so you're creating those centers that are beautifully set up, that they have all the materials, all the choices, so dramatic play and sensory and literacy and blocks, and they get the opportunity to explore them freely, right? Time centers or small groups absolutely can be beneficial, but making sure that children have some autonomy, a little bit of time in their day, preferably around an hour, but if you have to work up to that, that's perfectly fine, of where they get choice of what they're learning about is so important for them. Using open-ended questions. So make sure that you are asking them questions that further their play and further their learning and don't distract from it, don't take away from it. Loose parts is so beautiful. It's open-ended, and you don't have to be a full buy-in to loose parts, right? Like loose parts curriculum itself is very open-ended and there isn't a lot of structure. However, you can use loose parts in your classroom and see beautiful things. So for example, here, the picture on the right, these are chopsticks that were left over from the cultural lesson on China, and then it's just dried beans. Honestly, that was it in a jar, and that lasted for almost a month where these children would build, make designs, and just the most random things would come of it. They would talk about shapes. I would love to hear their conversations at like snack time about, hey, what should we build today? Well, we're going to make a little farm. And so that's what they're doing here is they're like making their little fences for their farm and they're going to plant their beans. So just all the different things that they have to think about. And then those collaboration skills and they're having conversations. They have to problem solve because they have to work together. Just so many beautiful things happen when you have loose parts. And then having materials that the children want to engage with. So then the picture on the left is this beautiful cabin that we got donated for free. So I'm a huge advocate for going to thrift stores and garage sales. You can find some of the most amazing materials, but children they're drawn to beautiful natural tools and materials. So making sure that you have those opportunities for them to explore in that. And then, like I said, just capitalize on those questions when they're there, that it adds into it. So not takes away from their learning process.
Okay, just for time purposes, Rose, how are we doing? Do I need to go faster?
I'm thinking so. We got about 15 minutes. So yeah, we'll
Okay.
speed it up.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce to you guys two kind of as a married pair. So integrated curriculum and active learning in connection with the number 7 developmentally appropriate practice, which is intentional teaching. So when we can link those two, we are thinking about how we can make meaningful opportunities in a very integrated, active way. We think about intentional teaching because when we're in early childhood and when we're in primary education, it's not just fun. Oh, you got to color. It's not a laissez-faire. Some of those things that I think might sort of there's like this perception, right, that these are just kind of fun learning opportunities, fun, but they don't have any real context behind them or developmentally appropriate richness. And I would argue that that's not the case. Those images that Rose has integrated into the slides show you that when we can be intentional with, okay, one of the precursors to fine motor and writing development is their ability to explore with markers and Play-Doh. And if we can allow them to take a pen or a marker or a writing tool and explore with scribble, with line formation, with loops, that allows us to actually start to have that precursor to letter formation. If they can't make a curve, it's going to be really hard to make a C. And so when we can kind of link that intentional teaching with experiences that are active, which when you have a second to come back if you wanted, this is from ways that we can see active learning taking place across a center-based approach in a classroom. Anything you wanted to add there, Rose?
I'm gonna just quickly go over a couple of the pictures. Um, so all the different they that repeated exposure, they feel more competent in what you're speaking to and more invested in it, and they're going to want to explore and they're going to feel safe in it. So here's just some examples. I won't spend too much time, but gross motor, sensory, writing, as Sydney touched on, dramatic play, art. I mean, there's so many things you can do with one concept. And here it was the little old lady who was not afraid of anything, which is a beautiful cumulative story if you're not familiar with it.
I love that. The next developmentally appropriate practice is, of course, creating positive relationships, which, if you want to go to the next slide, Rose, some things that I think are important to kind of highlight. we have to ensure that we're creating a safe space for our children so that they can take their risks, that they can feel secure in their learning experience and environment. They have to build up that emotional resilience to take a risk and maybe have a failure, to be able to explore with other children that they don't know, to be able to predict or solve a problem and problem solve. So positive relationships are really important. And I think the interactions of what we say and do, our empathy, what we show nonverbal, but what we also can communicate verbally, and that time, the opportunity to kind of show compassion, and then vice versa, how we're helping them collaborate. These same four principles that we want our children to be able to have with us are the same four principles for positive relationships we want to have with our families. So if we can take time to do the same four with our families, to have these meaningful interactions, if we say our door is always open, but we never leave time for families to come visit with us, or we don't have an opportunity for someone to step into our space so we can step out and visit with families, then what we're saying doesn't match what we're doing. If we can have an opportunity to show empathy and validate families, both maybe by written communication, but also by verbal communication, that's really important. If we can take time to engage with them for showing compassion about what they're experiencing and help them through things that might be difficult, but also on the flip, rewarding and celebrating when there's something happy going on, and use them as a resource to collaborate. So as Rose noted, there's definitely resources in your community that can allow you to see experts of navigating cultural responsiveness and relevance. But also, if you have families who are from a different culture other than yourself, lean on them, ask them for that advice and that expertise, because that's going to build that positive relationship on their end.
Okay, then just quickly here, you're just making sure that those relationships are the base of your pyramid, right? That you make a connection and an intentional time to make that with them. And then the concept of serve and receive, I hope you're all familiar with. When children are looking for interactions with you, especially in those younger ages, they're going to look for eye contact. So in that infant room, when you are feeding a bottle, yes, it can be really hard to navigate 9 other infants, right? And the aide is trying to bust through diapers and you're feeding a bottle. But making sure you make that time when they're looking up, that you do meet their eyes, and that maybe you offer some sort of verbal like confirmation, some sing song, making sure they feel comfortable and met. So, and that happens all the way, I mean, through young childhood, even into adults, right? We want to feel when we're seeking your attention that you're able to reciprocate it. So serve and receive is super important. Emotional literacy is super important. And then involving the families, like Sydney said, so making sure you're willing to collaborate. This is actually Sydney's mother-in-law that came in and read a story on kindness for, I think it was Kindness Week. And then we have a social emotional calm down tool here where the children are making silence. So just provide the best environment you can by making sure you're intentional with your relationships with the children and the families in your care.
One of the links that Rose sent to you guys in your email, it's the very last link. It's a video on serve, and they call it serve and return. And so it's actually a child caregiver, maybe a parent, if I remember correctly, and a little maybe toddler at this stage, but not quite infant. And it's talking about setting up like a serve and receive tennis style, like table talk tennis kind of, and how valuable that building that vocabulary just through a couple of things, making that eye contact. But it doesn't have to be a lot. It's not like you have to sit down and have this long conversation like you would with an adult, but it's enough interaction that shows them this is how we communicate, this is how we interact, this is how we convey ideas, and then building those language structures. So we've touched on this one, so I'm going to bypass this one and go to the very last one. And feel free to come back to these images as resources in terms of intentional teaching or frameworks that could be helpful. But the last one that we have here, oh, sorry, Rose, did you need anything from that slide, or are we okay to go on to this
No,
one?
we can jump ahead. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So the last developmentally appropriate practice is to use ongoing assessment to inform your practice. And essentially, this is sort of the cornerstone of what we do as educators and teachers. We want to be able to see if we've got these milestones or developmentally appropriate kind of norms. Here's what we want our children to be able to work towards by the end of this year before they move into this next room, before they move into this next grade level. This allows us to be responsive to our teaching. We can kind of see, are our children making progress? If we already have identified needs and challenges, how are we making progress with those identified needs? And one of the best ways we can do that is through observation and playing and visiting with children, just sitting right there. But we also want to be systematic in how we think about that. We want to be thinking about, how do we document that? How do we gather that information so that it's not all up here, that we have some way of tracking and assessing and supporting that process. When we have that knowledge of where our students are at and where they're going, we can really then be better at optimizing their learning experiences and setting them up for success, leaning in on their interests and their readiness. So this kind of model just shows how valuable it is to observe, kind of organize that information in a way, but then we can use that to share. Our children, of course, need to know how they're doing. We often think, the parent is, or the caregiver or the guardian is an important stakeholder, and of course they are, but we want to communicate with our students as well. We also want to be able to use that information for our stakeholders. If we're looking for funding, if we're looking for opportunities to buy new things, we can use, hey, I've seen success when, and here's the data or the tracking form or whatever system you're using in your school supports this. You have a stronger likelihood of gathering new information, new funding sources, new opportunities to enhance your classroom.
Love it. Yep. So data is very important, and it can be as simple as anecdotal notes. If you don't have a current assessment tool that you're using, or even like in the infant toddlers, if you're just doing like a milestone checklist, these are just some quick pictures. I'm not going to dive into them, but we talked about earlier about meeting each child where they're at. So if they are still working on tracing lines, meet them there. But if they want challenged and they want to write 1 through 50, like Sydney's oldest, then you meet them where they're at. So you need to make sure that you pay attention to their developmental needs and what they are expressing interest in. Okay, this last one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it could be its own training, but also the developmentally appropriate practice of the classroom environment, routines, and schedules are so important as well. So how you set your classroom up is just as much a part of developmentally appropriate practice as the other 8 that we went on about. Okay, we're going to cruise through these resources. We sent them to you guys. You should be familiar with the early learning guidelines. I was hoping to have time to show you how to scaffold. However, I deliver a whole training on how to break it down. So if you'd like to sign up for that, whether independent study, have me come in and do a private training, or the next time it's on the calendar, please feel free. It's using early learning guidelines as a lesson planning tool and a child development milestone checklist. The South Dakota CKC is kind of your own internal reflective piece to scaffold your own learning. So if you are at right now at this level of being able to speak to developmentally appropriate practice, but you want to be here so that you can advocate to your stakeholders and say to your director, hey, I need more whiteboards in my classroom because the children love it. They're exploring pre-writing skills and we only have one. Now you can show and talk to why that's appropriate, right? Because now you're more confident and competent and you can speak to why you should have it. So how do you move from this level to being able to advocate, right? So this document shows you how to move through that. This is free as well. If you would like it, please drop me an email because I am notorious. If you just tell me here in the chat, I'm going to forget it. So please email me so I have some sort of paper trail. Here is that great infographic that Sydney prepared. I think this would be beautiful to have like laminated up or even in your like lesson planning to kind of reflect back on. The pre-submitted questions. I want to touch on these really quick and then we'll get into the evaluation. So, we use a set curriculum that doesn't allow for implementation or planning of other learning experiences. How can I approach this with my admin? What do you think, Sydney?
Great question, first of all. So thank you if you are on here and this was your question. And I have a couple of questions that I would love to ask as well in the process. And feel free to unmute if you would like to. But one of the things that I wondered about when I first saw this question was think about what you're noticing is the need. So if you feel that there's something that your curriculum doesn't have, I think it's helpful to kind of identify and articulate what that is. And if you can communicate that to your admin to see this part's working well and this part needs to be more developmentally aligned, then you build a stronger trust and openness about what you're doing and why you need to make a shift, why you need to pivot in order to explain this is what's going to move the target or move the needle for my child, from these children. So I think I kind of want, if you're on here, to kind of unmute if you have a second, just to clarify if that's helpful or not, because I would love to be able to ask a follow-up question if you think that that wasn't a helpful answer.
They called in sick, the person that
Oh,
submitted.
okay, okay, no problem. For those of you that are on here, though, hopefully that's a helpful thing to consider and keep in mind. Rose, anything you wanted to add on to that?
Nope, I absolutely agree. I think when you can take your knowledge and speak to it, then those people are going to be able to listen to you in a way that you're going to be able to do what's best for the children. So, and it might also create a conversation with your admin that they can speak back to you on why this set curriculum does meet that and what can you do in your power then to provide. So maybe you can alter the learning objective is XYZ and they expect you to use a worksheet. Well, if I don't want to use a worksheet, can I have them come over and do the same concept in a sand tray and they're using it to do whatever letter or learning objective? So having that open dialogue, I think, is really important to making sure that your voice is heard. So.
Mhm.
And then the second one, I have parents at my facility that want to see paperwork sent home so they know their child is learning. How do I navigate that conversation?
And if you're on here and you ask this question, I love this question because I have been that parent at one point in time. I felt that if I did not see the physical work of what was going on there, I would wonder what is going on there. And I have learned. I have grown as a parent and as an educator the value of what perspective this means when we are choosing intentionally to not have just worksheet after worksheet after worksheet. Now, is there a time and a place for a graphic organizer for students to put things on paper in a more kind of formalized way? Of course. However, I think it's very helpful to understand where families are coming from and understand why they need that. And I have had such great conversations with Rose and my early childhood educators to better understand what they're doing. And to me, what really helped me as a parent was to see what was going on in the classroom. I think from all the bad things that happened with COVID, one of the probably most influential and beneficial pieces was social media and digital communicating because we can't always have site-based visits. We don't always have guardians and caregivers and parents who are able to come on site and see, and they can't volunteer. They don't have time or they're working. We can not assume that all of our families have that opportunity, right, to just come into the facility and see what we're doing. So one of the things that I thought about is if there's a way to show through imagery, through communication, through videos, that's a strength that we can say, here's what we are doing. If we can have our individual children take a photo next to something, if they can show and verbalize, if we have a chance to do something like a back and forth folder or a back and forth binder where a child maybe selects something that they're really proud of, or we take a picture of a developmental milestone, they're able to stand, they're able to hold the spoon, they're able to do something developmentally that's a marker for success in our classroom. But we can take a picture of the toddler doing that and we can send that home maybe monthly. I think that's pretty amazing. So, oh, thank you, Elena. I appreciate you being on here. I understand. Rose, anything you wanted to add?
Nope, just to really capitalize on that conversation piece, to have that open dialogue, to answer questions, and then the documentation process, whether that is through the virtual means, like Sydney said, sending them home, or if you don't have an app, use old school Walgreens or super cheap to print photos and put them on display somewhere so that parents can see those learning opportunities. You spend so much time planning, celebrate yourself, put them on display, right? Okay, this next slide, we're not going to get to, but it was there. I would love for you to reflect on this when you have time, maybe at nap time sometime. And it's just walking you through a scenario and look at those bolded words and really try and do some reflection on what key concept in developmentally appropriate practice do you think is here? Is it this one? Is it multiple ones? So really engaging in some critical thought there. Okay, so to wrap up, this is just a fun quote, but everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its whole life believing that it is stupid. And I think Sydney said that was kind of like our underlying theme is that we want to celebrate the individual child, meeting with them where they're at. So making sure that you form those relationships, they're authentic, and the child feels seen, you're going to be able to better serve them and their families here and implement developmentally appropriate practice to where that individual child is at. So you are engaging in the most important work, right? You're creating safe and happy environments to help these young little kiddos develop into safe, happy, and functioning humans. So you guys are doing, the most important work there is. And I hope tonight your understanding of developmentally appropriate practices was expanded and that you can see how much of what you are currently doing is developmentally appropriate. That you were able to, looking back on some of those answers, which I'm going to read as you're taking the evaluation, and say, you know what, I am a developmentally appropriate practitioner because I can do this and I can speak to it. So hopefully you'll leave tonight with a more strong sense of confidence to be able to speak to it and validate it in some of your practices. Okay. We're not going to navigate over to the website. You guys have all seen it. Maybe I will do that as well when you're taking the evaluation. I'm going to stop sharing briefly and drop the link to the evaluation in the chat and the QR code as well. And while you were filling that out, we're going to go over a couple of things. Two. Copy. There's the link. There's the QR code. So go ahead and fill that out. We're going to first start by looking back at your chat, and Sydney and I are going to kind of look at each answer and maybe help you understand where you already are developmentally appropriate practicing. I can pull up the chat. Here we go. Okay. So Amy Fowler says, big motor skills obstacle course. So Sydney, where do you think in those 8 principles that this type of learning activity is meeting?
Oh, I love this. Well, first of all, it is active. So if we think back on our developmentally appropriate practices, we know that one of them is going to be integrate curriculum and active learning. So awesome. Definitely active. We also can see that that would be an opportunity for positive relationships. We can also see that it would be an opportunity for social context and play-based. It kind of it hits many, Rose. Nice job,
I
Amy.
agree. I'm a huge supporter of anything physically active, so I think you could align this to a great many things. Like also where the child is, that individual variability with an obstacle course. Perfect, right? You could set it up for the toddlers to maybe just have to crawl over something. Then you have a 4-year-old, and now you're adding in maybe some soccer dribbling between the cones. So yeah, it's a beautiful example.
Yeah, I love that if you think about being able to then scaffold or have intentional planning, if the obstacle course has always looked that way or looked that way for maybe a day or two, time to set up a new road barrier or obstacle so that the student has to problem solve. I think that shows that you've considered that student's readiness and then you've made those adjustments as needed.
The next one, I'm going to guess, okay, Banana's iPad. Let's see, Virginia and Julie are still on, so I'm going to guess that's Andrea. I use puppets, and Puppets are so beautiful. You can use that in so many ways. And I guess where I'm going to jump in here is that social emotional learning, like getting to see and hear about some of these concepts that can feel a little abstract for a kiddo through something that is engaging and allows them to practice like role play and like charades almost is such a good way. So what about you, Sydney?
Agreed. It's definitely play-based. And when I think about the developmentally appropriate intentional teaching or even ongoing assessment, if a student is using a certain vocabulary word, completing a full sentence, being able to expand beyond just a word or a phrase, you can use that observation of how they're playing with their puppets to assess not only their cognitive, but their social development, their emotional development, and then again, kind of being able to intentionally plan for how you could use that puppet interaction and their interest in and seeing what they know about a new topic or a new concept. You could also use puppets as a way to have them demonstrate what they know about something. So almost activating schema or looking at background knowledge.
Awesome. Elena had the next one. My science day is always a hit, but also any art project that my littles love dirty. So I think this is like that play-based, like love being dirty. The open-ended is really going to draw kids in, right? Yes, there's a place as a parent for those handprint crafts because parents love to see the growth of their child. However, what is going to allow for deeper learning and more authentic experiences is when it's open-ended and those children get to come and explore and proceed through it on whatever terms and ideas they come to.
Definitely. One of the others is integrate curriculum too. So it sounds like this is a great day for you to integrate multiple parts of your day or thematic study through Science Day, which is kind of cool.
And Julie says, I like to get down on the floor and play with the babies. So it sounds like you're practicing already that serve and receive, right? That you're getting at eye level, you're giving them that intentional conversation piece, you're helping them grow their vocabulary, like the beginnings of that literacy skills that they're going to need. So
Definitely positive relationships as well, and understanding individual variability. So the serve and receive, but also being able to scaffold when you have that one-on-one time.
and then the last one is Sensory Days by Jen. So again, this can come down to a lot of different things. Like when we think of sensory play, we usually just think of like the physical that they're developing here, but they have to learn how to problem solve because sensory play is usually a very popular center. So how are they going to navigate turn taking? How are they going to navigate creating something and having it fall apart because they've never played with moon sand before? So there's some of those executive function skills that are going to come about when they're getting this exposure.
Mhm. I also think if you throw in various items in a sensory bin that ultimately can get sorted or categorized, you're again kind of helping, as Rose talked about with executive functioning. Executive functioning is really linked to how our students are doing what's called information processing, and we know that it's really hard for students to take a lot of information and take that short-term memory and move things to long-term memory if their executive functioning skills are not there, if they're not able to take what's in that short-term memory and move it into the long-term memory part of the brain. So take the sensory bin that they've had now exposure to and practice with, and they're familiar with it, and change that up, change what's in that sensory bin so that the material itself is familiar or the center is familiar, but you're changing what's in that so that they can continue to take something that's familiar and move into new topics. This is one of the best ways to kind of lean in on something familiar when we're introducing something new.
Okay. So that was all of the feedback in the chat. Thank you everyone for providing those examples. And now hopefully you feel some affirmation that you guys are doing amazing things already. I see 3 evaluations turned in. As soon as you finish that evaluation piece, you are free to go. If you'd like to hang around, I am going to share my screen again and play the trailer from Sentenced, which is another really great educational documentary that's all about the importance of literacy and those early literacy skills. And hopefully you'll see the importance in what you're doing. So I'm going to play that in the background. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm very appreciative for you guys all coming tonight.
Rose, I was just going to say, this is Virginia. I was the one that was talking about the puppets.
Oh,
and
sorry.
And that's okay. My name keeps changing when I put it in my iPad. But I was going to say, one other thing is, if you have a shy child in your class, it helps them to come out more, because they, it's the puppet talking, not them. And so that is really helpful.
Absolutely. What a beautiful thing to think about, and that you have recognized those individual child differences, right? That you're helping an introverted child feel comfortable to use their voice. So great. I love it, Virginia.
Study after study show that at-risk kids who do not read at grade level by 9 years old are destined to a lifetime of struggle.
Okay, my wife texted me.
Sorry, lady.
I don't know how to say that. She wanted you to help me read it.
I don't know. Please. I don't know what special yeah.
43 million adults can't read well enough to get a basic job.
Try to go get jobs. They tell me to fill up the application. The closest I've been is my name, and that's it. How would I work if I didn't know how to build cars?
Both of my parents have been murdered when I was younger. School to me was like, I didn't care because I didn't have my mom.
Each year, millions of kids are sentenced to a future they don't deserve because of their inability to read.
If you can't learn to read, you'll continue to struggle, and slowly we begin to lose you.
It's just failure after that.
Every year, millions of children pass through our school system while actually falling farther and farther behind, heading towards a life of struggle.
I know my ABC. It's words I don't understand.
My son, he's going through the same issues like me. I hope it don't affect him in the future. I was devastated. Big word. Devastated. Don't know how to spell it, but yeah.
You know, I'm gonna do all I can to level the playing field.
Hey, how you doing, Brother Rico? I'm Marquise.
So you got a sound on.
Oh, it's spelled.
Yeah, there you go.
Once you learn to read, you will be forever free. Frederick Douglass.
Okay, so I saw some other chats come in. Love it. That one is for free on Peacock. The last one that we watched last time is actually, we bought a DVD so that we can share it out with you. I know Amy had expressed interest, and Amy, it's coming to you next. We have it with a provider right now, so that one was no small matter. But like I said, this one is free streaming on Peacock. So again, thank you all for coming, and a big thank you to Dr. Haugland Sydney for humoring me and jumping on with this. I really appreciate your time.
It was an honor, so thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. And if you finished your evaluation, feel free to log off, and I hope I see you in June, and that one is about program management, and we're going to be diving into staffing, which if you're an admin, you know, super hot topic, but also as a teacher, it can really struggle. It can feel hard to constantly have to cover other teachers, take children from other classrooms. So that'll be kind of our area of focus on that one.
Are you still recording, Rose, or did you have that stopped already?
I am stopping it right